Hi, I'm Rebecca, and this is my course presentation for Psych 415. So my presentation is separated into five sections: my introduction, my literature review, my methods, my conclusion, and then my references. Starting with my introduction, my research question is, what are the experiences of raising children for adults that were mistreated as children? What is being studied? Well, the experiences of adults who were maltreated as children, now they are parents. For this study, maltreatment is defined as neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse, or emotional abuse, anything that could have an effect on the child's development. We'll also be looking at the long-term impacts, being that parents' worldview now, as well as the techniques that they employ. Why did I choose to study this? I personally quite enjoy child psychology. I find it very interesting. So being able to do something that looked at the longer effects beyond just the child in that moment is something I thought was really neat, as well as I think looking at these trauma and difficult experiences are important to better understand how to help people moving forward, as well as just gaining exposure for these kind of things to help with the stigma of speaking out about things that you experienced. Next, my literature review. First is Does the Apple Fall Far from the Tree by Fieber et al. 2024. It is a meta-analysis done on how the behaviors of parents affect the way their children develop goals. This is relevant to my study because as a meta-analysis, it combines various other studies to provide background information on what has and hasn't been researched. Some of the areas outlined in this that are relevant to my paper are how the parents' goals influence their child's goals and the level of care, either being negative, which would be abuse, or positive care, which would be positive, and how that affects the child's capacity to learn. It notes how these children are not provided support, that they need to have more intrinsic goals because they need to get validation somewhere other than their home and within themselves. And so that creates a lot of compensatory behavior, which would be interesting to look throughout the study to see if these parents who are also processing the trauma they went through exhibit these kind of behaviors and if they're putting on these values to their children. The next study I'd be looking at is The Intergenerational Effects of Childhood Maltreatment by Green 2020. It is also a meta-analysis, and I think that these are both good background ones to start with, just because of that, again, it looks at a whole bunch of papers and brings in a general consensus of what the conversation is at this time. This paper focuses on the idea of the cycle of violence, that being abused makes you more likely to abuse, but also different abuses ranging from sexual neglect and the parenting styles, which again encompass my study, as well as the ways that this can kind of show how people are processing trauma. It generally groups people who are mistreating their children into some ways into compromised parents, which is being neglectful or overly attached or again outwardly abusive, and then positive parenting, which is being much more lenient than a normal parent would for their children. It would be interesting to compare these overall results from this meta-analysis to what we could find in this study. Next is my methods section. And just to reiterate, my question is, what are the experiences of raising children for adults that were mistreated as children? For simplicity's sake, I have separated the section into three subsections, so we'll be starting with sample. The inclusion criteria for this study would be having people between the ages of 25 and 40, having adequate language skills, and actively being in therapy for an issue regarding their childhood experience. The age range I have is because the Statistics Canada states that the average age for having children is around 30 to 32. So I chose to have a little bit older and a little bit younger than what that average is to create more possible samples, but I didn't want to make it too broad just to have similar times of upbringings for these people, just with how technology changes so many things. English language skills are important because these will be recorded and transcribed into English, so just to make sure everything is being conveyed properly. My exclusion criteria is if the individual has lost or has ever lost custody of their children or are a single parent and are currently dependent on a caregiver who mistreated them. The exclusion of single parents is just known to mental strain as well as potential socioeconomic strain and as a way to try to standardize the participants. And we have dependency of caregiver because if they're dependent, it's possible they might not be honest about their experiences and their feelings of what their parent did to them. And then lack of custody is just then there has probably been a higher level abuse issue at some point to lose custody of their children. So we would not want to look at that for this study as it is outside the scope. Next, for my recruitment of the sample, it would be a modified snowball sample. A traditional snowball sample entails having a small group of original participants that then refer others who fit the criteria to the study. In this case, I consider it modified as my original group would be first the therapist that we contact, as then the researcher would provide the researcher would provide their contact information to the therapist, who would then provide it to the people who are seeking therapists, so the actual possible participants, to then have them reach out to the researcher to participate. For my study, there would only be 4 participants selected. The reason for this is though there are no exact rules for discourse analysis, which is the method we will be looking into, it's recommended to remain small for IPA, which is 3 to 6 in Shaw 2019. So to keep my 2 studies consistent, even though we won't be looking at the IPA study in this one, I've decided to use both studies as having 4 participants. Next up is data collection. So I will be using naturalistic data, meaning data occurred naturally without the input of the research. Generally, a good measure of this would be if the data could pass the dead scientist test, i.e., would the data still have occurred without the influence of the researcher. The data we will be collecting is a recording of the therapy sessions of the individuals already seeking aid for their issues. So this data is incredibly likely to have occurred, and this conversation would likely occur even if the research study had not been taken place. The reason why this data is so good to have, even though it is a little bit more difficult, is it is very authentic because, again, it's a conversation that is just what the person having. They're not being prompted because of this, as well as it's flexible because it doesn't have any set questions that the person's having to follow. So it is really just their interpretations of their experiences. Next, how we're going to be collecting this data would be through visual and audio recordings of the sessions and then transcribed into a Jeffersonian transcript, which will be outlined in the next slide. The 2 most prominent ethical concerns regarding the collection of the data are as it follows: the consent of the participants and the understanding of the lack of complete confidentiality. Both the therapist and the participant need to be aware that they're being recorded and the manner of the recording, and they should understand that there is a potential for the participant to withdraw at any time within a specific period in case they no longer feel comfortable sharing it. This also goes for the therapist if they at one point decide they no longer want to be part of the study. The other major concern is that this study cannot be completely anonymous, as the researcher is technically unaware of the participant's exact identity, as they have gotten this information from the researcher, but these stories cannot be completely depersonalized without losing meaning. So there is an awareness that there are some personal details that could potentially go through. So the style of transcription is Jeffersonian, as it does allow the researcher to extract meaning from the conversation by analyzing all aspects of the person communicates through their words, pauses, body language, and the volume. That's just a few, and they're noted in specific ways, as we can see here. Comments are brackets, are descriptions of actions. Word with 2 arrows on the side is an increase in speed of talking. We have up and down arrows to note increase or decrease of notation, and a bracket with a period to note small pauses. This is a way so that when you're annotating the data that you are able to know what happened from the video, which this is another reason why it's so important that the data collected is video and audio so we can get all of these things. Next up, we have what we'll be using as our analysis method. So that would be Foucauldian Informed Discursive Psychology, which I'll be referring to as FIDP just for simplicity's sake. So this is using top-down assessment, which means starting by looking at the bigger picture of what a person is saying and then focusing in on the small things that came to create the story the person's telling. FIDP wants to understand the why behind what the person's communicating, to see the types of beliefs and experience that they've had that led them to the values they presented through this narrative. And just again to reiterate, examining the talk in a way of the version reality of their experiences. It's not looking for objective truths, it's looking for what they experiences and what the consequences of those experiences have been on their worldview. The philosophical background that supports FIDP is post-structuralism. And so it seeks to understand knowledge of truth and power in the way that someone uses language. It's the idea that meaning comes from within, not from the world we exist in. For within lecture, the most likely aligning theory that we've talked about would be social constructionism, as the goal of this kind of study is not to prove or disprove anything, it's just to understand the way story is told and the deeper meanings behind it. So there are approximately 8 steps of FIDP, not including the Jeffersonian transcription process. So the first step would be becoming familiar with the data, then keyword coding. Third step, code with a discursive lens. Fourth, review, consolidate, conceptualize. Fifth, collate, confirm, and develop. Six, identify a discourse to focus on. Seven, analyze each extract. And eight, perform the write-up. These will be outlined in the next following slides. So first, familiarizing yourself with the data and the transcript. It is important to know the whole story before searching for meaning within it. So this should be done with as little analysis and bias as possible. So beyond just a few notes that take place in a reflective journal, there should not be any interpretation or analysis done at this step. The second step is to do keyword coding. So this is in the left margin. Make notes on the transcript with sections that get a keyword. So for this would be parts where we mention our parents, our children, neglect, and hurt, just general main ideas that are relevant to what we'll be researching. The third step is to look through the data again, but with a discursive lens. This means in the right margin, you should be looking for a deeper meaning, what's being said. For example, if a participant would be discussing a time they felt that they were punished by their parents and they didn't deserve it, you'd look into what about the situation was upsetting and how it affected them now, and why it stuck so deeply with them. The first step, the fourth step is consolidation. So this is looking back at the previous 2 steps that we've just done and looking deeper into that idea of why. Is it to go back and keyword in a more specific way? So again, consolidate. The fifth step is how we can collect the excerpts that we already have. At this point, it will be roughly sections with the keyword and each fragment kind of tells us with. So looking at these excerpts to see if there's a moral or a theme that's being enforced or constructed by what the participant's saying. It's important to be mindful if at any point of the process you kind of shift at what the person is saying or what they're constructing, and you need to note why they're changing. So for example, of this, if you feel like the general bits are that they're very angry at their parent, but then as you're reading through it, you start to see more of like frustration and sadness. It's important to note why you saw that shift and in what ways what they're saying enforces these shifts and feelings. So the sixth step is to look at the excerpts and their constructs with discursive devices, which are identifiable parts of storytelling, which point to certain social actions or expectations. So some examples of these would be hedging, which is when a person speaks in incomplete, rushed utterances to kind of indicate there's a delicate issue there. There's assessment, which is explaining how you feel about the world, or an evaluation. So being like, I don't like this thing. I did not like when my mother would leave for hours. Script formation appears typically, so I'm not really, it just shows a behavior. So these are important to understand the construct, because if a person is hedging a lot about a certain topic, it's probably something that they're very uncomfortable about and something that has affected them deeply. Next is analyzing each extract, which is step 7. At this point, you take a step back from the analysis and you look at the bigger picture. What does this explain about the world at large, and what is the reason that they've chosen to explain it this way? You want to see how what this person has said about their upbringing, their abuse, or maybe how they're dealing with their own children. How does this explain the way they interact with the world? The last step is the write-up, which is your findings about the why and the reality that the participant has, and the ways in which that perspective supports their worldview and makes sense of it. So we'd be going back, looking at those discursive devices and using those to help support the facts we have come up with to explain the worldview. So in the write-up, it is really important that you do use exact excerpts from the text to back up your claim and the analysis that you've done for them. So last, we have our conclusion. So, my question, one last time, what are the experiences of raising children for adults that were mistreated as children? For this, any method that has a big emphasis on meaning making, interpretation of story are better suited to deal with this topic, because trauma is subjective. It is important to do qualitative research on topics like child abuse and its effects, because it cannot be standardized. We can only gain insight from people's experiences to help navigate the future. So choosing methods which don't really look at just data and look at the person as a whole individual are a better way to get a holistic experience. And then these are my references I used.